a story to start with. But during the summer, between my sophomore and junior year in college, I worked at a summer camp for underprivileged kids. It was in the Appalachian Mountains. It was called the Christian Appalachian Project. And we did all the usual kind of camp stuff, swimming and all this. But the interesting thing about this particular experience at the camp was the menu. Because we ate lots and lots and lots and lots of rice checks. General Mills had donated cartons full of big blue boxes of rice checks for this camp to eat. And we discovered, the scuttlebutt anyway, as to why this major donation of dozens and dozens of boxes of rice checks had come to us was that they were actually what you might call factory seconds. They had missed the vitamin spraying process where they, in the food manufacturing process, when it gets to the stage where they spray the vitamins on so that they can say what the nutritional content is of it, it had missed that stage. And so these were just unvitaminized rice checks. So at least they were filling, and that was fun for the kids to eat. A little bit tiring for the camp counselors to eat rice checks every morning, but they filled us up. The interesting thing about that, though, is I didn't think anything much about it at the time. It was just, oh, well, okay, rice checks, they just give us this to eat, because they don't taste any different when they don't have the vitamins sprayed on them. And I can only assume, though, that perhaps they're a little less nutritious. They must be, or they wouldn't have to spray the vitamins on them in the first place. But as I've reflected on that, and this story just came back to mind as I was thinking about an analogy I wanted to draw today to some of the things we've been talking about. Because in some ways, I think that represents the modern food paradigm, where everything is processed, and we think we're taking what could have been a natural way of doing things or a natural process that would be organically nutritious, and we take the nutrition out, and then we find another way to put it back in, and sometimes it's even worse. I go to Spring Hill once a week for a business meeting, and often I will go up to the Kroger in Spring Hill. Now, this is not an indictment I'm about to make of just the Spring Hill Kroger, because you can see this most anywhere. And in fact, the Spring Hill Kroger has one of the larger natural foods sections to its credit of any store around. But when I first went in there, it's a big mega store. I mean, it's one of the giant Krogers that's got stuff besides groceries too. It's kind of like a Walmart light, but they do groceries big time. And there is one aisle right in the very center of the store that is nothing but soft drinks. Coke, Mountain Dew, Pepsi, every possible soft drink, and it's huge. The aisle is it is probably a bigger area of floor space than our house. It's just monstrous. And they've got both sides, and then they've got down the middle, they've got the center displays of the crates with it all in it in the middle. And I looked at that and I thought, wow, that's amazing. People drink all that stuff. And then there's chips and cookies, and you start looking around, whether it's at Walmart or Kroger, and there's all this stuff that people love to eat, but none of it's really healthy for you. It fills you up, but it doesn't nourish you. And so I've thought about that a lot, particularly as our family has really been trying to make we've been on a long journey to try and really winnow through as far as eating goes and come up with really healthy alternatives. And Nancy's done some wonderful research and found that, interestingly enough, there are many long lost ways of eating that preserve nutrition in food in ways that we don't know how to do these days. Ancient processes, that are done to some extent. The ways of preserving food are fermenting and preparing foods, and certain things that even there are reasons because of how we process food now that we think that meats and eggs and butters and things like that aren't healthy for us, but they really are in their natural state, and all these kinds of things. We tend to consume the things that don't necessarily nourish our bodies well. It seems to be the American way. And as I thought about that, I think there's a spiritual analogy to that as well. We feed on a lot of things spiritually that aren't really as healthy for us as they could be. And that is why I believe we're on this journey of the ancient faith. I believe you see symptoms of this in different ways, and there are a couple of ways that I think we see this hunger manifested these days for rootedness and for a deeper spirituality, for a heritage of the faith that's missing. One way is through what seems to be a stronger and stronger emphasis these days on some of the teachings of the earlier stages of the Reformation, which are arguably actually good things. And I had a really interesting email conversation this week with somebody who pointed out that the Reformers were trying to literally reform and go back to the ancient ways of the church. So it's a very well-intentioned thing. And what ended up being articulated out of the Reformation in many cases is simply things that had been part of the organic church in the early years, but in this 500-year window right here that we've talked about so many times, got not exactly lost, but sort of blurred. And so some of the key issues like justification by faith and things like that were obscured here. And so the Reformation kind of felt it had to grab some of those things and articulate them in ways perhaps that weren't articulated before, but not because they were missing before. There was not the reaction that going on here. It was more of an organic belief system back here. So there's one inclination of people these days is to go back, I've said before, to the safety of the Reformation, because it feels like that's the closest to what we commonly experience in the Protestant church these days. But then there's another reaction that, in a sense, goes almost too far. Back before the time of Christ, there's a lot of people these days who are going back to keeping the Old Testament feasts just as they were articulated in the Old Testament, and engaging in some of the Sabbath-keeping laws and things like that. Again, very well-intentioned. They're using Scripture as the source, but what I say it represents is a longing for something that was there in the early church all along. And if people could just understand what is going on in these first few centuries, it takes into account the Jewish roots. It takes into account the truth the apostles taught about how we're justified by faith. Everything, I want to say everything comes together, but actually it came together. And it was in operation in these early centuries of the church in many ways that we can't grasp. And the reason is, I'll give you another personal story here. I'll tell you my story. I have worked in the Christian publishing world in one way or another for about 25 years. And for most of those years, I have attended each year, the annual Christian Booksellers Association convention, which is this mega trade show where publishers come and they show their new books, and people who create Christian gifts or Christian artwork or Christian music are all there to share their new wares and the things that are just coming out on the marketplace. And it's this big, marketplace. It is. That's what it is, actually, where all these people are buying and selling, or selling the books, the music, and all this. And as I've walked around there before, I have been interested because you see everything from on all different sides of the theological spectrum. You see there are Catholic publishers there. There's people that publish Benny Hinn. There's people who publish John MacArthur, all over the theological spectrum. And it occurred to me that it represents what I think has happened in particularly modern American Christianity. And what it is more of a free marketplace of ideas than it is a sense of what really is true or what is not, and how we know things are true or not. And I think it's really important to consider what that means to say that modern American Christianity is mixed up in a free marketplace of ideas, because that very idea itself is more American than it is Christian. And just to remind you, if you don't know, the free marketplace of ideas is a sort of political economic concept that was first, the seed thoughts came from John Milton, but they were developed further by an Englishman in the 19th century named John Stuart Mill. And Mill presented the idea that in a society, it was best to let people speak freely and not be controlled by the government, so that any ideas that anybody wanted to share could be aired in public. And then the people would get a chance to look at that and decide what they thought was right. Well, in a political sphere, it's an awesome idea. It really is. It's a great idea. Because what it does, the theory was that truth will always win out. Whether it's an idea about freedom or how society should be governed or not governed, the truth would win out. Like I said, great idea in the political sphere. Interesting thing about John Stuart Mill, though, he was an atheist. And one of the reasons for developing this way of thinking was that he didn't believe there was any reference point, no absolute truth. And so it was a matter of utilitarianism. What worked best, what didn't work best in a society was kind of the measure of truth. Well, that idea has been very influential in America, and I believe it's been tremendously influential even in the church these days, as people don't have any foundation for deciding who really has a corner on the truth or who really doesn't have a corner on the truth and the way things should be done. And so this free marketplace of ideas, as represented, as I said, in all the different books and teaching tapes and all this kind of thing that comes out, is what we end up with. Denominations. Nobody's got a corner on the market. Well, I'd like to bring in here something from Scripture that I think points to the problem and also the solution that we're trying to bring by looking back here. If you want to follow along, I'm going to read from Psalm 78. You don't have to, but here it is. Give you a second to turn to it if you want to go with me. Sometimes it's kind of nice just to listen to Scripture being read. So Psalm 78, I'm going to read the first 8 verses. My people, hear my instruction. Listen to what I say. I will declare wise sayings. I will speak mysteries from the past, things we have heard and known that our fathers have passed down to us. We must not hide them from their children, but must tell a future generation the praises of the Lord, His might, and the wonderful works He has performed. He established a testimony in Jacob and set up a law in Israel, which He commanded our fathers to teach to their children, so that a future generation, children yet to be born, might know. They were to rise and tell their children, so that they might put their confidence in God and not forget God's works, but keep His commandments. Then they would not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not loyal and whose spirit was not faithful to God. What I think this psalm articulates is several important things. One is that we need to listen to instruction that comes passed down to us. If Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever, then there's no reason to think that he's not been working all along to pass things down to us that we need to pay attention to. I believe there's two things that get in the way of us receiving that these days. One is that I think because of what happened here, this is the downside of going back to the safety, as I put it, of the Reformation, is it set in motion a point where people end up thinking that they can stand in judgment over the church. That individuals get to stand in judgment over whatever was decided here. And we, in our, I think particularly American Protestantism, have come to the conclusion that we also can evaluate what these people back here in the early years of the church did, and that somehow we know better than they did. That there's some kind of progressive revelation that's been going on, and we understand now better what they should have been doing back then than they did. And I think there's very good reason to think that that is completely false. It's upside down. In fact, we should be the ones paying attention to them to find out what we should be doing today. I'm going to get to a couple of examples, but I'm not sure if I have time for two examples, but I'll get at least one of them in a little later on today. Another thing, this speaks of responsibility. We must not hide them from their children, but tell a future generation the praises of the Lord. If we don't, we're transgressing our responsibility. We need to not only not refuse to tell them, but we're often guilty of hiding them, sometimes just out of pure ignorance. And I think that's really the problem with a lot of people these days. They just don't know. They're hung up on preconceptions and ideas of what we've decided in our modern world, modern being the last couple hundred years, let's say, should be the way Christianity is done. And so anything that looks real different to us, for instance, icons like we talked about last week, we assume that we know better than that. That somehow we've come a long way and now we don't need to do all that stuff. Or that's somehow, or even worse, there are people who have construed it as pagan, which it's not. But if we hide the truths that are there to be passed down, we're guilty of transgressing what this is directing us to do. Then, what happens? It says, what happens if we don't do this? We become like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not loyal and whose spirit was not faithful to God. We end up in a rebellious or arrogant spirit because we're not looking to those who really have the truth to share with us from the past. And I think that's why we believe we can stand in judgment over what went on then. So, having said that, let me move on and give you some very interesting examples. You know what, let me point one other thing out here. I haven't said a lot about this as we've talked, but let me just give on a personal note here, how I've gotten to this. It's important to know each person's personal journey, I guess, but for me, about 20 years ago or so, is when I first got really interested in this whole issue and went from having been raised Presbyterian to going to a lot of different churches. When Nancy and I lived in California, we attended Jack Hayford's Church on the Way, a great Foursquare church, and a lot of different things like that. And ultimately, once I grasped some of these issues about where our modern church came from, I chose that our family needed to become part of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And so that's what we did about 20 years ago. And the thing about the Eastern Church, that's this bottom line here. That's the line that runs along the very bottom of this. And everything else has come off of it because it was once part of this one church, and it's the one big chunk of it that never went its own, well, I say it never went its own way. It continued on in the old ways. And so one of the things that is also difficult for people these days, and I think it comes from this arrogant and rebellious spirit that we have really unintentionally taken on for ourselves, and I think it's even well-intentioned. We have a hard time with the idea that anybody would have managed to continue some of these legitimate early ways of keeping the faith, and it's not us. That we're not the ones. We modern American Protestants aren't the ones. We can't deal with that. It's shocking to us because we think we're the ones that are on the cutting edge. But the fact is we're not. And that's the real bottom line of why we're trying to figure out what is. So let me go on and explain to you something that is a very interesting story. I've mentioned this before, but I'm going to talk about it in a little more depth today because it represents a number of different things. And I'm going to write a couple of words up here that we'll talk about in the process. First word is sacerdotal. And another word is Eucharist. And I'm writing these words up here because they're the kind of words that we're not very comfortable with in modern Americanism, in modern American church. I'll write one more that is implied. It's not, I'm not going to read specifically about this one to you, but sacrament. But the reason I'll tell you why I put that one up there first, because these words, if anybody's ever heard of them or are hearing of them, they get a bad rap these days. People don't, a lot of things that are going on in church, whether it's seeker sensitivity or whatnot, don't like things like sacrament. There are whole denominations that don't believe there's such a thing as a sacrament, and yet, let me explain something about that word. It's a reflection of the incarnational truth of God. Because what sacrament means is that the physical is the place where God meets us. His grace breaks through in the physical world. And sacrament is a way of saying we experience that. We experience the reality of God in the physical. There's nothing wrong with that. Jesus Christ becoming an incarnation is the ultimate sacrament. The spiritual world taking physical form and bringing grace to us. So now I'm going to back up here and talk to you about a couple of other words. And I'm going to explain a situation. This may sound a little familiar. And like I said, I'm going to go a little more in depth. There was a situation that arose during the 2nd century. It is known by scholars as the Quartodeciman controversy. That's a mouthful of a word. But the essential problem here was that the church was having a dispute about how to celebrate Pascha. Now remember, Pascha is the original word that we now most of the time call Easter. It's a celebration of the resurrection of Jesus at the time of Passover. Pascha having been, of course, the Greek word for Passover. So the early church was dealing with this issue of how to celebrate Pascha. And I want to read to you, first of all, what Eusebius, remember Eusebius is our church historian who wrote his history of the church around 320 or so. And I want to point out how he introduces this when he gets to this part of the narrative of church history, which again, this is happening probably around 120, 130 AD is when this is coming to a head. And he says, a question of no small importance arose at that time. Now think about that for a minute. A question of no small importance. How much do we think it matters today to know how you should fast before Pascha? How many people wonder about how to celebrate Easter the right way? You do, right? Is that what you're telling me, Seth? Okay, I'm glad. I'm glad you're concerned about that.
Because my birthday is close to Easter.
What could be a better reason? You know, my birthday is kind of close to Easter too. We have that in common. So is Andrew's. So, my point here, I'm going to stop right here because I want to talk about how significant this idea is. We, in our standing in judgment over these people, look at that and say, how silly. How silly that they were worried about how to celebrate it. But let's turn that around. If these are the people, and let me explain to you who these people are, I will read to you some names on the list of people who thought this. Among these are Philip, one of the 12 apostles who fell asleep in Hierapolis, and his 2 aged virgin daughters, and another daughter who lived in the Holy Spirit and now rests at Ephesus. And moreover, John, who was both a witness and a teacher, who reclined upon the bosom of the Lord, and being a priest, the word priest referred to John the apostle, wore the sacerdotal plate. I'll talk about that in a minute. But before we are too hasty then in saying, well, this couldn't possibly matter, bear in mind who we're taking issue with. Philip, the same Philip who baptized the Ethiopian eunuch, and John, the same one who laid by Jesus at the Last Supper and followed him and wrote the Gospel of John and 3 epistles and gave us the book of Revelation. These are the people that we are taking issue with when we say how silly it is to worry about how we celebrate Pascha. The issue, and now let's drill down. What was it that they were concerned about? Well, Pascha is based on Passover. It was the pulling forward of the Old Testament feast of the Passover into the fulfillment that Jesus brought with his life, death, and resurrection. These early Jews, these people in the first century, knew who Jesus was, and they placed him at the center of Pascha because Jesus had put himself there. It was no accident that Jesus came to Jerusalem and he died at Passover. And they understood that. And that's why from the very beginning, John and the other apostles were concerned about how we translate that Old Testament feast into the New Testament reality, the new covenant in his blood. That's what's at stake here. That's what's going on in these people figuring out the right way to celebrate Pascha. So what was the question? The Jews observed Passover, and the Passover occurred the 14th day. It was celebrated the 14th day of the month of Nisan, which was the month during Passover, of which Passover occurs. Well, what the early church had started doing was observing that as a period of fasting in preparation for celebrating the resurrection. And there were some that took the position that Passover marks the time at which we should celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. There were others who took the position that, well, Passover sometimes ends in the middle of the week, but we have already established the pattern. This is it. They had already established the pattern of recognizing Sunday as the day to celebrate the resurrection. That's why we worship on Sundays, in case anybody didn't know it. We worship on Sunday because it's the first day of the week, and every Sunday is a miniature Easter or a miniature Pascha. We're doing that to celebrate the resurrection of the Lord. So and they had already been doing that prior to this controversy, because there were those that said, no, the way we were taught is, yeah, we celebrate, fast up through the Jewish date for Passover, but then if Passover comes on, let's say, a Wednesday of the week, we'll extend the fast for Thursday, Friday, Saturday, 3 more days, so that we can then celebrate Pascha on Sunday, which we all know is the Resurrection Day, and we shouldn't be celebrating the resurrection other than on Sunday. So who... okay, I got ahead of myself there. So they're concerned about when this is celebrated. And my point is, we would look at that and say, man, they're just splitting hairs. They're just, what does that matter? We're not supposed to observe special holidays and feasts. Well, somehow we are, evidently. And that's what they're demonstrating here by the practice of the early apostles. And so when we write that off as unimportant, we're the ones that have the problem, not them. The way they rectified this is they did ultimately gather together the bishops, the leaders of the church at the time, decided, well, let's just get together and talk this through and figure out what we're going to do. And ultimately they decided that, yes, in fact, Sunday would be the day that we would do this on. And this is what was written about that.
Which is why we don't celebrate it according to the Jewish calendar, correct?
Right. You're saying that's why we don't celebrate according to the Jewish calendar? Mm-hmm.
The early church had established Sunday as the day of resurrection, right?
That's right. Right. And of course, the season still follows the Passover season, but that's why we don't actually celebrate Easter, Pascha on whatever day Passover ends. It's because of what happened right here. And I just want to basically read a brief part again from Eusebius. He said, he titles a whole section this, How All Came to an Agreement Respecting the Passover. That's the title of his section here. I'll read a portion of it, see if any of this sounds familiar in the practice that they executed. Those in Palestine whom we have recently mentioned, Narcissus and Theophilus, and with them Cassius, bishop of the church of Tyre, and Clarus of the church of Ptolemais, and those who met with them, having stated many things respecting the tradition concerning the Passover, which had come to them in succession from the apostles, at the close of their writing add these words. Okay, so that was Eusebius leading up to this, is what was the direction given. Endeavor to send copies of our letter to every church. Wonder where they got the idea of meeting as a council and then sending out a letter about their decision to the different churches. Yeah, that happened in Acts, didn't it? So they're following a pattern. And not only that, they're taking authority. It's an authoritative pattern that they're working under. No free marketplace of ideas going on here. The bishops are deciding this is the way it is, and that's how we know. We show you indeed that also in Alexandria they keep it on the same day that we do, for letters are carried from us to them and from them to us, so that in the same manner and at the same time we keep the sacred day. And they had no compunction about calling it a sacred day. There were things that were sacred or holy. Sacerdotal, by the way, I didn't come back to mention that. You notice it said something about John wearing the sacerdotal plate. Sacerdotal is a word that means priestly or having to do with the priesthood. It even named John as a priest there. So again, we come to the place where we've either got to decide that yes, we do know better than they do, and so we shouldn't consider that we should refer to John the Apostle as being priestly, Could it be that maybe he's being viewed as now stepping into the Old Testament pattern, and he's picking up the priestly mantle that had been the purview of only the Levites? Or we can say, no, we know better than that, or that's been abused in the past, so we shouldn't do it anymore. Or we could say, well, we probably better figure out how to recapture some of that that's been lost. Otherwise, we're not going to do a very good job of what Psalm 78 says, of passing it on to our children.